Welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. My name's Ralph Cree, and this is brought to you in association with bodyheartmindspirit.co.uk. In this episode, I talked to Jahan Khamsehzadeh, who has written a book called The Psilocybin Connection, Psychedelics, the Transformation of Consciousness and Evolution on the Planet, an Integral Approach. So he's written this amazing book on psilocybin mushrooms, and he also works at the Atman retreat center in Jamaica that specializes in delivering psilocybin ceremonial journeys for people. And he's a facilitator there. And he's also trained with the Mazatec people in Mexico, in the sort of the oldest culture still running that works with psilocybin mushrooms, and also done deep psychological training, somatic therapy, and those kind of things. So he really knows his stuff in this world. And magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, are something I think are amazing, and I've been into them for about 25 years. They grow widely all over the United Kingdom, as they do across, as I learned from Jahan, all over the entire globe, apart from Antarctica. So I really enjoyed connecting with Jahan on this subject, and I hope you enjoy. Jahan Khamsehzadeh.
Good.
Welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. And,
honor to be here.
Right. We're here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. I'm really, really excited about this. And I came across you because you'd recently written a book on the subject. Which very detailed, and you've had some very elaborate training in the field. I've been taking psilocybin mushrooms for about 25 years, and they grow all over the countryside in the United Kingdom, and up until 2005, fresh mushrooms were legal. You could even buy them in shops, it is something that is illegal now. But a lot of police departments in the country have said, well, look, we're not worried about that sort of thing. We're just going to get on with proper policing, So it's kind of one of these liminal subjects that's kind of in the gray areas, and it's got a lot of press. It's been in the newspapers a lot in my country and in the United States, places with people using it for therapy, which is what your expertise are in. That's the kind of broad context for this conversation, and you've written this amazing book. What I would love to open up the conversation with is perhaps you'd like to start with the training.
I know several years ago, I decided that my dissertation was going to be on psilocybin mushrooms. And I came from a background of integral theory for many years. But I knew in my life, they were the transformative experiences I had beyond meditation, relationships, community, therapy. They are the greatest resources of my life, inside and spiritual experiences. And I've been thought about journeys that I'm 38 now, that I had starting at 15, and they were a part of my daily living life. And I thought it was the best way I could be of service to this world, to help facilitate and mediate these experiences. And there's a approach to this. There's the strong academic part. I went through a doctor's program in consciousness to be able to focus on this, and also wanted the real world, practical, hands-on training. I went through a multi-year training with the Mazatec tradition, going down, in Mexico, and training within a lineage. The Mazatec's historical use of mushrooms goes back thousands of years to the Mayans. They have the Curandera Maria Sabina comes from that lineage. And then I also wanted the Western psychotherapeutic approach. So I assisted for 2 years at the psychedelic certificate training at CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies. It was one of the first above ground strong trainings. And then I mentored for a year at the School of Consciousness Medicine. I've been holding legal psilocybin ceremonies with Atman retreats in Jamaica. So there was very much, a hands-on approach of seeing people's lives transform radically. Half the time overnight. It's beautiful. I've seen that happen with myself and many other people. At the same time, when it comes to scholarly work, I read Terence McKenna's book, Food of the Gods, at 19. I was already obsessed with evolution, but the idea that we evolved because the relationship with psilocybin mushrooms that had been so strong in my life quite struck me. And as I continued in academia for about 2 decades, I hadn't come across a better theory of our development. This was based on ecology, on diet, on chemistry, on neuroscience, on archaeology. It's just a very grounded explanation for our emergence. And so because my focus had been the evolution of consciousness, it caught my interest and I stayed with it until my 30s. And I was like, this needs to be told and spread and updated. So I dove in really hard, read 75 books just on psychedelics for that work, and hundreds of others to really create the context of that. And the book's coming out April 5th. It's called The Psilocybin Connection, Psychedelics, the Transformation of Consciousness and Evolution of the Planet, an Integral Approach. It's on Amazon right now, Barnes & Nobles, Google Play, and it's published by North Atlantic Books. It'll be put out also, dispersed by Penguin Random House. And so it's the accumulation, feels like, of 20 years of work, but 5 years of just solid focus. And for me, gives context to psychedelics. I feel they change our lives, but I think the missing context is that they're within an evolutionary framework, both of a personal development, like integral theory, that consciousness develops an individual, but within that lens of say, spiral dynamics, because I know the audience might be familiar with this, of turquoise, that we're a part of a larger living system, and the ecology and environment also evolves. And so when we start to look at something like mushrooms, I was since 15 stuck in this idea of like, how does this exist? How does this huge higher ordered experience that gets you in touch with yourself and the cosmos, this is not random. And when we look at the neuroscience, for example, it creates a hyper-connected brain state and stimulates neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons. This isn't some kind of just messing up biotoxicity in your chemistry. So when we look at mycelium, it's this large underground living network that pretty much evolved before plants and created the soil for plant life to evolve on Earth. So our ancestors have always been on top of this living system. And that this beautiful framework that interconnects all the plants in the environment arises, first, the cap and stem formation of mushrooms, but then with it, psilocybin. That perfectly fits into our serotonin receptors better than serotonin itself, with no biotoxicity, and stimulates the growth of our brains. So I think this kind of living system, larger evolutionary framework, I think gives a better context for not only psilocybin, but psychedelics in general, since most of them, like the tryptamines, are well known. They're just a few different atoms difference. All of them fit into the same receptor site. So I thought this conversation and context was missing, and it helps us with our missing story of how did we get here as humans. I was very concerned about our origins. It's a big deal. We don't even know how we arrived here. And so it's almost as if our species has this amnesia. Like, how do we know where we're supposed to be or going if we don't know how we arrived? And so this kind of helped complete the picture. What I thought was almost the one of the greatest mysteries, the emergence of humanity.
And I definitely want to circle back to the stoned ape theory, which you're referring to, because it's really, really interesting. And I think when someone has taken psychedelics, it makes a lot of sense. Perhaps to people that haven't, it seems batshit crazy. But I think from the inside, it does make a lot of sense. So, one of the things that I feel is so important to talk about this topic is that there's a real lack of decent initiation for young people. When you look in our modern secular culture, and we look at different tribal cultures, societies from around the world, and they have these carefully guarded and very ancient rites of passage for girls turning into women and boys turning into men. And because we haven't kind of explicitly got these in our culture, what tends to happen is young people, they get to their sort of teenage years and they start to experiment with, a lot of people experiment with different drugs, psychedelics, different, some hard drugs, alcohol, these kind of things, because they want to get out of where they've been. And, as children, they want to be able to take a perspective on their life up to that point. That's the sort of ecstatic nature of it. And so I think that since the 1960s, these substances have kind of formed this unofficial rite of passage for a very large portion of our the people in our culture. And it's all a bit haphazard, and I'm really hopeful that we're moving towards a point where we can actually, so say, there'll be retreat centers like the Atman retreat center you work at in Jamaica, but in England, all across America, across Europe, New Zealand, Australia, a lot of these other places. And because the first time you take a psychedelic, it is life-changing for most people. And I once was at an ayahuasca ceremony, and everybody was sharing at the beginning, and this lady who looked to be about in her 70s said she'd never taken any substances at all her whole life, and then in her 70s she tried ayahuasca for the first time, and she said it was such a surprise. And I thought, what an amazing thing, like to wait that long to have that experience, and what an impact that would have had for her to have lived so many decades, never known that this was a thing, and then to have that experience. So maybe I don't know, with your Mazatec training, that's in sort of Mexico, is it? Or
yes, Oaxaca, Mexico.
Yeah. So did you see a rite of passage tradition alive and kicking with the Maztecs?
Yes, it's a huge part of their culture. Beautiful, amazing, humble, peaceful people. As soon as you enter the main town within the Mazatec, society, it's Cuautla de Jimenez. There's a 12-foot statue. You go down the main road, 12-foot statue of a mushroom. On top of that's Maria Sabina with her hands open. It says, "Welcome to the magical city." It says that in Spanish. And once you go to the downtown, the city center, there's 12 mushroom murals. Right next to the church, the cop cars have little mushrooms on them. Maria Sabina, the curandera that made the West aware of mushrooms, has almost been elevated to the status of a saint there. And so for a lot of these societies, the entheogenic, / psychedelic societies living today and those in the past, they were passed on from generation to generation. And so the space holders, the curanderas, we would call the medicine people, women or shaman, they were initiated into it as their parents did it, and their parents did it. And so the people I went to study with, this has been part of their family line for generations. And over there, it's generally held space in ceremony for families. They're largely a matriarchal tradition, so a lot of the women hold the ceremonies, and they'll hold it for you and your partners and your kids and everybody together. So you'd have many generations in the same room. As the same way, say psilocybin hyper connects the brain, it also, I think, does that systemically with relationships. So much about it is healing the relationship within ourselves and other people, healing the fractures. And so it's very beautiful to do within that context. They start young, 5 years old, and the biotoxicity helps awareness, brain growth. I wouldn't be surprised if women take it pregnant and it's in their breast milk. And I think it keeps them in harmony, with themselves, each other, and the environment. So that rite of passage starts very young for them, and it's just a part of their lives. And they see it. The Europeans came, so they kind of have it in a Christian context. Also, they pray to the Lady Guadalupe, but they also look at it in the context of healing. So they ask spirits to ailments. They don't have as much of a trauma background as we do, so they come and ask for the body to be healed or guidance to be served. When they take the mushrooms over there. So to answer it's been a rites of passage throughout your life at that, for everybody within that society.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And I love the idea of families taking it together. I mean, what that could do for families, in our culture. Huge. Wow. Yeah, because
it's huge. I've held 7 journeys. Go ahead.
No, you go.
I've held 7 journeys for my dad. Starting in the 60s. My dad's in the 60s, and I've held several journeys for him. Amazing life transformation. Absolutely incredible. There's a whole new dimension to his existence he never thought would be possible, and the way he's changed and become a better father, and a deeper relationship with my mom. It's been incredible. One of the best gifts I've had in this life is participating in that experience with my father.
Wow. Yeah. And you've at the Atman Retreat Center in Jamaica. Has it been hundreds of people how many roughly ceremonies of people have you initiated into this experience?
Yeah. I'll just say lots.
A lot.
And the way it's set up, it's 12 people at a time that come, and I go and participate in a few ceremonies. So 12 people come, they leave. Another 12 people come, they leave, and it's for each ceremony structure, it's 4 days. They come in, rest. We have a preparation. Almost the entire second day is just ceremony. Third day integration, and then another kind of integration before they take off, and then prep calls before they leave, and then integration calls. Once they're back in the U.S. So. And a lot of them have kept in touch over the years. And so it's beautiful to see the development, happen over the course of a time, to see just people's abrupt changes, letting go of addiction, getting closer to the partners. A lot of us, I think, in the world are working on self-esteem. That's just a part of like Maslow's hierarchy, the topper levels where people don't feel like they're enough. And that part deeply heals, that deep child with a connection with the inner child, a feeling like I'm enough so I can actually actualize and become who I am and start to follow my purpose. As the studies have shown now, going on decades, about 67% of people have a mystical experience. And it's hard to say there's any more rewarding experience in this life. It really can change you overnight.
So there's sort of two different ways that people go into the experience with mushrooms. One is to have they set an intention. There's a particular subject they want to explore, and then the other way is just sort of giving yourself over to the mushrooms and letting them do with you what they will. And I think in my own practice over the years, I kind of started off a bit in that kind of what you might call recreational use at festivals and psychedelic trance, parties and those kind of things. It's a bit free form. Then I kind of went into a bit of the trying to tackle particular subtopics in the journeys, and then that's kind of changed into just a sort of letting the experience be self-organizing. And I don't ever nowadays go in with a particular thing. I just let the mushrooms do what they do. And there's this kind of I think I've built up a lot of trust, and I think in the beginning you don't necessarily have that trust, and it's something that's earned, and the mushrooms have earned my trust over the years, and maybe I've earned their trust. So it's this mutual thing. But with these ceremonies you do in Jamaica, is there room for both of those approaches, or do you prefer people to start with an intention, or what do you do?
Yeah. I'll probably share first, about myself a bit before I jump into that. I heard a little bit of your podcast earlier. Myself also, I've done hundreds of journeys, 3, 4 more hundred journeys. And at that point, I have a similar approach to you where I just surrender myself over. I was an atheist until I took mushrooms. So now it's very much a deep connection with God. That's the term and word I kind of approach this living consciousness. And it's kind of just an openness and handing myself over to what wants to arise. As you mentioned, self-organizing, or Stan Kroc, the psychedelic psychotherapists have been around for decades, started transpersonal psychology, would say holotropic states of consciousness, states that move towards wholeness. And so I've come to that approach. That being said, most of the people that come, I say 90% of them are in pain. There's enough motivation in their system to want to come to the other country to try something new. So most, by far, people come in because they've been suffering, and they've been suffering for a very long time. A lot of them decades, and they've gone through all the traditional methods of healing. All the medicines, all the therapies. What we've seen with the research, it's 80% effective for treatment-resistant depression, meaning people that they've tried everything and nothing has worked. 80% of those people get to heal. It's incredible, higher rate than I believe anything else. So 90% come with this impulse for very specific reasons to resolve this inner torments and fraction that they have inside, largely depression and anxiety, and those together go very well. About 10% come out of curiosity. So it's a very different approach. And so because they're coming in with some level of pain, they have an idea of what to come in. It's our job also, as guides, to help them clarify that for us to understand, so we can help guide them in the process, bring back their attention, come with our understanding, of Western psychology and psychotherapy to see what healing needs to happen. So more or less, we are a little bit more focused and acute on the journey to help them get what they're wanting. The majority, 50, 60, 70% of these people have never journeyed before. I know they want to come somewhere where it's safe, where it's legal, where it's very professional to have this experience in healing. And that being said, there comes a point where I think an openness approach is also beneficial, but it's not coming from a place of deficit. You're kind of surrendering yourself over. As long as you're coming and you're needing something because you're in pain, I think it's very wise. Most people I see that they come with an intention, they get it. You can come with 2, 3, 4, 5 intentions, and a lot of the times, like a checklist, like it happens during the journey, and they receive what they're wanting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then that sounds. I mean, what a gift to have that center. I did an interview a while back with a guy who runs an Iboga retreat center in Costa Rica. And I think it's so great that there are these places in the world where this is all legit. If you've got the money to go there, it's there with people who really know what they're doing. They've created the sort of perfect container to have this experience. If people have got the funds to do it, what a great introduction to it, because it's kind of a bit of the Wild West here in the West, with this sort of underground scene. And I think my initiation into this stuff was just with friends in the early 1990s. We didn't have any books, we didn't have any internet, we didn't have any elders, we had no instruction. Yeah, I mean, one time I even ground up a load of nutmegs and had that, and later found out that you can actually kill yourself with nutmeg. I had a horrible experience, but it doesn't have to be this way. It really, really doesn't. And so what a great thing that you're doing these things. So you've got the ceremony with 12 people there, and then the other sort of setup that seems to be quite popular now is the one-on-one session with a therapist, that they're doing
Yes.
in
Yes.
MAPS and Imperial College in London and those kind of places. So you must talk about that in your book. And
yeah, it's my preferred method that I would share with people. Absolutely, you can go a lot deeper. I hold monthly integration sessions with SF Psychedelic Society, and so it comes up every time. And I think it's the safest approach for any human, but even for people that are seasoned, to go to with the skill guide, it's highly encouraged because you can drop in a lot deeper and let go. The point being that not only this person has some level of technical skill and understanding of the experience, but hopefully you feel safer with them in the room. If you don't feel safer with them there, they're probably not the right person. And so that your system can relax and really, really let go. And so as you probably know, you can get in some terrifying states in these, journeys where you think you're dying or you're dissolving or I'm sick, or get stuck in shame or fear or just anger. Like to have somebody there to help heal, create connection, whether it's just holding your hands, your feet, look in your eyes, letting you know, okay, it's the difference between being stuck in a trauma response for like 5 hours or that passing within 5 minutes if somebody is there to help you move through it. So highly, highly encourage, first and foremost, with a skill guide. I think the hardest part of what's happening right now in the field is the demand is so much more than there are skilled people. And skilled people tend to cost a lot. And because the demand's so high and it requires lots and lots of training. And so there's a project I'm working on called Silo Health. We're creating a free 4-hour training. We've already recorded it. It'll be released like in the next month or so, where it gives enough training for people to sit with each other. So you can have, a best friend, a cousin, somebody there that has enough context and grounding information to create safety so people can start sitting for each other. So that one-on-one approach is definitely the one I'd encourage first and foremost. The group experience is beautiful. It's a different kind of medicine. There's a lot of healing when it comes to belonging. A lot of fracture can come from not feeling a part of our family system or society. What we've seen in this Jamaica setting, became a very apparent our first time that first and foremost, the medicine is the big part. But the second huge medicine was the group bonding. Everybody that comes, they get so close to each other. They undergo this huge experience. Almost every time they all keep in touch, create WhatsApp groups, email lists, and for years later, these groups are still connected. It's so much of what our psyche wants, as the medicine shows us, is this underlying feeling of deep interconnection. And we can have that spiritually and internally with the planet, but there's nothing like having it with other people, So within this kind of group field where there's this sense of boundary dissolving and oneness and going through this depth, through this cauldron, it's very transformative. And if you can keep a culture, a close group of friends to reflect that with, it's almost as if the transformation continues. So yes, first and foremost, the group session, the one-on-one, then group session. And then if you want to go it alone, but I've had some hard experiences with that, even after decades. And I think that's happened to a lot of people. So I would refrain from that, especially with higher doses, because you can get in some tricky spots.
Yeah. For a couple of decades, I've mainly been doing the psilocybin on my own. And I think I've got that kind of personality. I wanted to be a hermit at certain point in my life, so it's and I have really, like you say, got into some very, very bad places on my own. I must admit.
I hear you.
But I've always somehow managed to get out of it, the other end of it. And I think that's where the faith in, I think there's, faith in homeostasis, that there's this force that wants you to come back at the end, make you whole again. But I think I got into this sort of solo journeying because I, really like to go very, very deep inside myself. And so I've done the group setting, and I've done a lot of it on my own, but I haven't had this one-on-one experience. That might be something I might you try that out sometime and see how that goes.
It can be very beautiful.
And so one of the things I liked, I was listening to a podcast you did. You said that when people listen, say music and psilocybin are a match made in heaven. They really are. And one of the things you said is that it's best, in your experience, to use music that doesn't have any words in it. And that's been my experience too. I mean, I really like to not have the words there, because so much of what you're experiencing is non-verbal. To kind of like activate that part of your mind can kind of pull you out a bit. Obviously, words sound very profound. I mean, I have listened to people recite poetry, and I've been absolutely in awe of it. But my preference is for music without words. I mean, is there something more you might say about that? Perhaps there's might even be some neuroscience behind the logic of that.
Well, definitely, I think you definitely alluded to it, where I don't want people to get stuck on specific content, especially something outside of them. We want the wisdom to come from inside. It's almost the best kind of way I can relate a psilocybin state to people that have never done it. It's almost like you're deepening into a dream world. When you're deeply relaxed and you fall asleep, this visionary world arises every night. Similar with psilocybin, the deeper you can relax it, go and trust and surrender, more images arise, more sensations, and it's a voyage, and it feels very intelligent as you're being led somewhere. So I want that internal guiding prices to be presence, and not just somebody's vocals and the lyrics and the music, to take them out of it and take the focus away. And so when we take psilocybin, it's almost as if part of our faculties quiet down and others become very more sensitive. It's often hard for people to talk. And as you shared, as people start to focus on words, they lose this deeper interconnection often.
I think
and so it's nice to have.
That's one of the reasons why I like to do this on my own, because I don't want to talk to people. And sometimes, sometimes people want to talk to you, or they're like, oh, wow, look at this, or look at that, or listen to this. And it's,
Totally. Some of the best sessions for sure are the people, most of the time they're silent for hours and they're deep inside. That being said, part of my role though as a guide is to help them integrate their experience from this deep, say, unconscious or subconscious to their conscious mind. And that does involve some level of putting things to words. And so if things are going well and they're deep inside, every half hour I check in and ask them to take a snapshot or put some words so I can write them down, and so I can help them remember later. The internal experience can be so vast, profound, and so different than our every consciousness that people can forget like 70% of it. And so asking them to put a few words at some moments help them recall almost that entire gestalt. And a good metaphor I like, it's almost as if you're going out with somebody in the boat in the ocean, and they're doing deep dives for gold down at the ocean. And it's just go, deeper, get the gold, get the nugget, come back, give it to me, and another deep dive. So every 30 seconds is like 30 minutes, just go and do a dive, then come back, give me whatever wisdom you got so I can take a notes about it and do another dive. And so this way, it just kind of helps integrate more of it consciously. That being said, whoever the guide is, you're there more as a midwife. It's not about them and how intelligent or focused or good they are at this. Nature is doing the work. Like, it's so much more profound than anything a human being can be doing. I'm thinking of Terrence McKenna, of this little sign behind me. I'll show it later, but he has this thing, avoid guru, follow plants. Forget, it's not about the people are amazing, but nature has the wisdom that shows so much more. So it's kind of relaxing back and let nature guide its process. And so you're kind of creating safety, within the person, for them to have this self-organizing, self-transcendent healing experience.
Yeah. Well, that is a really good quote from McKenna there. And that kind of brings me to something I wanted to bring up is, really you're there to meet the mushroom and the experience, the nature, and the role of the shaman or the guru, and these are roles that are changing now. And it's what would you say about how, so some people would, they want to go into this experience, they want to know that they're going to be working with people who are going to help them have the most beneficial, deep, profound experience. Like, what would be your kind of checklist for looking for the right type of person or group of people to take you through this experience? Because the absolute worst experience, would be, under the influence, you're very, very impressionable, like those little baby chicks that imprint, on the first face they see. And if you're there and you've got some very, very charismatic, dominating person who's pushing their own worldview onto you, lots of concepts, things about the way they see reality, and they're kind of, you know what I mean? They're almost trying to press that into you. That's the worst possible scenario. And so many people have had that bad experience. So, what wisdom can you give to people who might be listening to this, who want to do this kind of exploration, in terms of finding the right type of people to guide you through this?
I could see some people giving some pushback what I'm about to say, but it's nice to see the person's credentials, meaning have they gone through some formal training, specifically in learning how to hold space? Are they a therapist? Or I went through 2 years of somatic psychotherapy training with Hakomi, where they have really focused and honed in skills in space holding, and have a therapeutic awareness. The reason I might get some pushback is I've seen other people who are like, well, that requires some level of privilege or finances or so on. And it's just, you don't want to go to a medical doctor with somebody that didn't have any kind of training, right? And it's the same when it comes to your psyche and your heart and your soul. You want them to have some level of training, because it does change a person dramatically, to have that skill set and that level of awareness. That being said, we're entering, as I mentioned, a space where the bottleneck of a psychedelic movement largely is going to be there's not enough trained people. So there's going to be people propping themselves as shamans or space holders or medicine guides, as therapists without training everywhere, that they've just done whatever amount of journeys and they're going to hold space. And so, another thing to look at is how much self-work they've done. Super, super, super important. That being said, they also need a skill set to learn how to hold space. And that's a skill set that you practice and focus on. So you can do all the internal development, which is important, but you need to learn how to almost just be present, and just reflect, and part of those trainings will help you hone in that this isn't about you. You let the guy, in a lot of say Hakomi, which I like, the client's always guiding you. You're just helps facilitating the process, and especially true in these psychedelic states. Their deep wisdom's coming up. It's for them to learn, not for you to impress your worldview or you to look good in front of anybody else's eyes.
Yeah, that's really, really sound advice. Thank you. Just looking at my notes here. So, right. What happens when someone freaks out? You're in Jamaica, you've got 12 people there, somebody's freaking out. What do you do, and what do you try and help the person do themselves? What's it like for you as a facilitator, and what's it like for the person having the experience? That kind of relationship you've got, and how do you kind of help them digest what they're experiencing?
And I'm fortunate enough that I feel good enough and attuned to everybody I've been working with that can help them regulate way before anything like that would ever happen. Because there's a lot of signs before that happens, whether it's agitation, fear, trauma. There's a lot of building up of energy, and there's ways to really soothe a person or help them reconnect before it gets anywhere near approaching that level where you'd have to restrain somebody or some of the sort. That being said, almost all the freak out, I would say the vast majority, somebody's in fear. So the focus is then help them feel safe before the system really revs up. Some approaches people could do, holding somebody's feet helps them feel a lot more grounded. You know, if they're feeling fear, they're probably having a lot of their energy or they're being focused in their head, you know, because there's like they're creating thoughts and there's a lot of focus on whatever thing is going on in their imagination, because physically they're fine. There's nothing to be scared about. So having their feet held really helps bring the attention down and helps ground them. I like gravity blankets. So I have like a 40-pound blanket to put on top of somebody, helps them get in touch with their body and their pressure, and it helps relieve a lot of anxiety. Hand holding goes very far. You know, I would say it's not so bad to say that almost our greatest source of fear is a sense of disconnection. You know, grounded in this idea that we are at our core are unity, a sense of oneness and deep interconnection, and it's a sense of being disconnected and alienated that creates anxiety. And have to survive, care for myself, or even dying is almost this deep, pure black loss of connection with everything and everybody I know. And so helping them feeling really connected, hand holding, looking in the eyes, hand on the chest, like I am here with you. And you can empathize and help them feel connected. Almost all the fear goes away. You know, through the Hakomi training, the teacher, John Eisman, he's been doing this for 30 years, teaching Hakomi, a brilliant teacher. He says the difference between trauma and a bad experience is in trauma, you felt alone. As opposed to I was in connection and I just went through something really difficult. And so trauma can be said that there's a part of you that feels stuck and isolated and fragmented. And the goal is creating wholeness. And whether that's a car crash and you felt alone, or a rape, even though there's somebody assaulted you, felt deeply alone. So you want to bring that part of them into connection with themselves and within relationship. And so figuring out a way to create that connection is going to create safety. It's going to soothe their system. You're going to help build trust. So they're going to listen to you. You know, there's no reason to move around the room or freak out, and attune with them, you know, and if that's done, people just tend to listen. What happens a lot in the psychedelic states, and has to do a lot, same with therapy, is people get into, I would say, the child state, the inner child. That's where like a lot of the trauma is. And so people regress tremendously. You know, it's often where people feel like they're infants or 3-year-olds or 7-year-olds. And so you want to build trust with that inner child and help them feel safe. And if that connection is made, people tend to listen. You know, their adult self brought them here and they want help. And so if the trust is established between you, the guide, and the participant, people tend to listen. Yeah. Music is great. You know, there's so many small tools to just try to soothe the system, to help them regulate, to bring them back down and feel grounded again.
Yeah, that is great advice. And I know what you're saying about the music, because sometimes, you know, you want a bit of music with a bit of darkness in it to take you into that place, you know, but then you don't want to play, you want a playlist that follows a lot of contours. You know, but it's, if you've gone through a really heavy patch, you've got some music that's really taking you in somewhere deep. If that moves into a very light, beautiful piece of music, it's like, oh, thank God. But, you know, and then you kind of get ready for another deep dive. And this is kind of, you know, up and down, waves in and out, pulsating kind of thing. And once you recognize that's just the way it goes, you know, you just like, you feel, okay, here we go, we're going in for another deep one, and then you can feel it coming out. But that's great advice. I love what you say there. Something that happened for me in my early 20s was through taking just a wide variety of a lot of psychedelics way too often, and I was studying shamanism in an academic context at university. I kind of reawoke this sort of pre-modern animist psyche within myself, which you know, we tend to in the sort of postmodern circles that I imagine you and I move in, there's a tendency to romanticize like the life of tribes and that worldview, because there's so much beauty in it. There's so much aliveness, connection, everything's alive, there's spirits everywhere. But it's not all about nice spirits. There are demons and malevolent forces. And I don't at all live in that world anymore. And it's been a long time, since I've had that kind of stuff come up. But at that particular time in my life, it nearly derailed me and actually almost drove me insane. So, have you, is there anything you could say about that, or experience you've had with that, or with yourself, with other people? And
lots within myself, seen it with others. I love the topic, by the way. To bring just some more, just a bit of cognitive context to these models. We look at some of your audience probably knows Integral and Wilber's work. When we go through models of paradigm development, we have the kind of shamanic animist worldview that was a huge part of early humanity that likely went on for hundreds of thousands of years within our species. As we then evolved into more civilized and industrial societies, a pre-modern, modern, now postmodern. And the point of Integral is to integrate the perspectives, and we're also seeing with Gebser's model of Integral, there's this animist view, and the Integral stage arrives when the worldviews are integrated. And this animist perspective that was such a big part of mostly the worldview as our human species has not integrated back into our modern psyche, right? It's been absolutely left out. And so unless you live in a traditional indigenous system, it's foreign to us. And so we haven't integrated what created a large part of our consciousness. And I think it's absolutely crucial for our species and our depth of wholeness for this animist perspective, not to just we abandon our worldview now and move into animism, but animism's included. Animism being that the world is alive at a very deep level, and it communicates. And so I'm grateful for my experiences. At 18, I had an experience that rocked my paradigm worldview within 2 hours. It was very drastic. I was an atheist, a materialistic, focused on science for many years, and depressed. That's a very depressing worldview. Very reductionistic to, oh my God, God exists and spirit is real and everything's alive and consciousness pervades everything, all dropped at once. And since that moment, the life has been just this constant flood of synchronicity, especially the next 3 years. It became very apparent that the environment is always talking to you, that there's one being and it talks through everything that is happening, including other people's words and movements and animals and so on. And it enriched life tremendously, because that's a deep level of connection and contact and guidance. And I can't even share how more magical and interactive and participatory life has become because of it. And it's one of those things, unless your eyes open to it, you've been missing it. It's how was I living for 18 years dead and not aware of this, to life, and it's becoming so apparent. And so it's greatly enriching into those things. It's hard to tell somebody that they don't have that experience, but it's a very almost different experience of being human. That being said, the view you said of more the evil spirits and still this paradigm of, I would share, of duality, that there's good and evil, going back and forth. And I think that ultimately stems from the schism of fear. And if you have a lot of fear still in your system, it takes a long time to work fear out of your being. It's born in our system through lots of generations and it requires a lot of letting go. If you start seeing these synchronicities, and I think fear distorts our perception, and so it skews things, and so we can see these signs and misinterpret them, And I was recently talking to a client that, because of some big spiritual experiences, he went through a lot of synchronicity, then moved into paranoia, resembling more like schizophrenia. Oh my God, everything's talking to me, but now people are chasing me, right? So you're reviewing the whole concept, but from fear. the key is largely letting go of fear. And for me, it's a deep grounded in this oneness. It's a far more of that non-dual approach that there's nobody, for the most part, that's trying to hurt you. You know, there's human beings that are living within themselves of a fractured reality that you try to hurt others and so on. I'm not saying the world's safe all the time, but the ground of being is a unity. And so for me, that has a deeper trust. And that's why I've seen many, you'd say, demons or really dark material in the journeys. And yet there's a deeper trust that even behind them and the depths of their psyche is God. And as long as I stay grounded in that, all that disappears and becomes just a facade. And a lot of entities arise in these states. And if they have more awareness, they're more aware of this realization of oneness. Any being that comes and has more awareness than we do probably realizes that we all stem from the same source. And so that's eased my being in, even with all the strong, mysterious, it's quote unquote looking evil beings, they all take the form as teachers trying to teach you something and give you strength, and never steered me wrong.
You raised a couple of things there which mesh with my experience. One is moving from a sort of dualistic worldview into a more non-dual one, where, you know, I had a Christian upbringing where you had good and evil, the devil and God. And as time went on, and, you know, psychedelics were one of the things that kind of pushed me out of that, was, you know, I don't live in that world anymore. But not to say that it's gone. Like what you're saying is I've integrated, you know, we've kind of talked about two worldviews there. We've got the kind of the animist worldview, and then the sort of dualistic religious worldview, sort of more traditionalist one. And I feel like I've kind of over the years integrated those inside myself. And the thing that helped me do that was coming across the work of Ken Wilber, integral theory, and all of that stuff. And it might be, I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but there's lots of ways to integrate this thing. But I think the key term is to integrate these things, assimilate them back into you, because our culture doesn't train you how to do that. And you need to find a way to do that, because it's not, you don't want to like say, oh, I can't do that, I got to push it away, it's too painful, I can't handle it. That's not an option. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that no matter how much you'd like to not live with those things, they're not going anywhere. And you need, the only way is to integrate them into yourself and become, say, like, you know, master of your own house, so to speak, or the kind of the gracious host, or so yeah. I mean, that's I like what you said there, and it's a massive topic. I mean, that's a whole podcast in itself, but you know, we just touched on that. But I think for people listening to this, seek some guidance on how to integrate these things into you, because you're more than those things. They're part of you, but there's so much more to you as well. So what else have I got here? So this is something people say quite a lot. People that have not taken psychedelics before, or they haven't taken large doses, or they haven't taken them very often, is psychedelics are cheating and they're the easy path. And, you know, nobody who's had a large dose of psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, San Pedro, any of these substances would ever come out of it and say, oh, that was easy. You know, it's like, it's almost like cheating. So you know, have you encountered that from people? I mean, you know, how do you feel about that?
I've definitely heard that a lot over the years from people. You know, let's just first First, yeah, start with what you just shared. There's nothing easy. I'd say the hardest experiences of my life have been on psychedelics, and the greatest, and definitely it plays the pulse. You're jumping right into whatever is there, like the realness of it all, whether it's an emotion or archetypal existence or the depth of your being, and you're forced to face everything and surrender control to whatever wants to emerge. So it's absolutely difficult and painful and terrifying at times, and so rewarding. And so you show up again, you do a proper good psychedelic experience and dose. You don't want to do it for a while. You're like, I am set for quite some time till I have the courage, the strength, the resources to go into something like that. So I think many times it requires almost a warrior mentality to go into. So and time begins to stretch. Those 6 hours can feel, I've been in states literally it's eternity, where I'm like, oh my God, I'm before the Big Bang. Like the whole thing hasn't even started yet, and you're in this timeless space, and it feels like forever. So even time gets distorted and elongated, and sort of begins to move. So just to talk about how rough they are, that's something I began to realize of, especially I think a lot of people that were more in traditional spiritual approaches, meditation being one of the, I think, greater techniques of spiritual development, and they look at it as a shortcut or cheating and so on. What I saw, it's still embedded in this paradigm of autonomy, that you have to do everything yourself. And everything that you're using somebody else or anything else for is cheating. And it's really, I think, losing connection with our ground of being, specifically of nature, of just nature didn't fuck up. Like it's created, 200 different species of psilocybin mushrooms around the planet. It's created at least 2,000 plants have DMT. It's flooded almost every environment and ecosystem with these compounds that catalyze spiritual experiences that have been there our entire human history, that predates humanity by millions of years. Our best estimates, psilocybin evolved about 65 million years ago, right? So it's been there far beyond us, and we use plants to make our bodies, ultimately, it turns sunlight into biomass to create our bodies directly and indirectly. It gives us our oxygen. Why not also, it grow our brain and give us these spiritual experiences? And so I think it needs a state of humbleness that, like, we can't do this alone. If we're coming from an integral approach, looking at the quadrants, that there's a correlation between our physical reality and our inner experience of consciousness. And then specifically looking at the brain, if I add a chemical compound to your brain, you're going to have a consciousness experience that you wouldn't have otherwise without that compound, right? So ketamine, we'll use, for example, because it's very different than the tryptamines like psilocybin. I give you ketamine, you're going to have an experience that you'll never reach in meditation. It's a completely different kind of experience. Same with you give you mescaline. All the meditation in the world is not going to give you a mescaline experience. That being said, there are compounds indigenous to our brain that, like DMT, that some of the tryptamines like DMT, sulfamimic, and psilocybin has DMT inside of it. I went through a period where I was meditating at first an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a day, really doing a deep dive and focus. And after 100 days of this, having that deep state experience, first of deep fear of like, oh my God, I'm going to die, I lose myself, and staying within, so when dissolving the view, like I'm God embodied and breaking through and beaming and confidence and timelessness. And the first thought arose was, I've experienced this on psilocybin, but this just took me hundreds of hours. Maybe my prior psilocybin experiences had made my ego less rigid, that it only took me hundreds of hours. And meditation has its own beautiful focus. It creates discipline. It's everyday thing that helps clear your mind. But if we're looking for the state experiences that I think are really a great resource that really speed our entire process by giving us glimpses that these things are possible, psychedelics are absolutely beautiful. And so I think there's no shortcut. It accelerates our process, but I think it requires a humbleness to know that we can't do anything alone. We're not meant to. We need each other. We need people to develop well. We need community, love, affection, warmth, touch. We need the plants. And that we're part of this larger interconnected ecosystem. And know that we've always needed something beyond ourselves, and that as Terrence McKenna say, we can't do it alone. And it's beautiful to be humble to that.
Yeah. Well, I've been meditating for 25 years or so as well, and I think, it took me about 10 years of really boring practice to get to a place where I started to consistently have mystical experiences in meditation. And I really feel like psychedelics helped me get through that period by actually delivering some mystical experiences while I was waiting for them to happen in my meditation practice,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, state experiences are really important. And I think also, having been so well versed in different states of consciousness through the different psychedelics, that helped me shift my consciousness in meditation practice to, I kind of was recognizing the perfume of some of these states, if you know what I mean. But I'd say the aim of my meditation practice is wow. There's a whole wormhole down there. I'm not going to open that up. But I'm personally, I'm a proponent of both practices.
Yeah.
Talking of McKenna's, this is something I wanted to talk about, was the difference between knowledge questions and wisdom questions. And I really, so a knowledge question is like, how long is that pencil? It's got a simple question, simple answer. Wisdom questions are much more amorphous, and they kind of come from the imaginal world and realm. And so I think something that kind of shifted a lot for me over the years was dropping trying to get knowledge from these experiences, but wisdom was what I was more interested in. And talking of McKenna's, Dennis McKenna, Terrence's brother, he's done roughly 500 ayahuasca ceremonies or journeys. And he said after all of that, he doesn't know a damn thing about anything. But that's not to say he's not wise. So, he's a very, very wise elder in the psychedelics community. And, he has cooked, he's a kind of a well-matured whiskey in that sense. He's a wise guy. But what he said after all of these hundreds of experiences is that in terms of knowledge, he doesn't really know anything, and that's not been the point of why he's gone back hundreds of times. And he's a knowledgeable guy. He's a scientist. So he's not talking about that. So for me, I think that's quite a big theme and something to kind of keep in the back of your mind when doing these things.
Yeah, it's something that I came to. I was obsessed with learning. Went to first school as a neuroscience major, then mathematics and physics for 3 years, and then majored in philosophy, minored in psychology and physics. Got my master's in conscious transformation and the doctorate in philosophy, cosmology, consciousness. And so learning became my primary focus. And that was partly propelled because of mushrooms. When I was 18, when I had this huge experience, I'd say connection with God, because it involves a voice and being led. It said love's the most important thing in life by far. Miles after that is learning. And everything is so insignificant to these things. As long as you have these two priorities in that order, you don't have to worry about anything else. And so, first and foremost is love. And I think that's where wisdom normally is. All wisdom, I think, is deeply tied with love. That aside, when that's not available or at the forefront, I focus on learning. And so I became obsessed. My mind was a drill 7 hours a day, all day, every day, trying to learn more, I think, in every way, where it's just all these workshops or schools or reading or a conversation. What I found in my mind was definitely this pull learning towards more intimacy with the cosmos, So if you have a deep relationship with a partner and you're getting to know them, you want to know everything about them, because the more you learn about them, the more you see, the more closer you feel. And it's almost the same thing is happening with the universe. The more and more and more you learn with the cosmos, the closer, more intimate you feel about it. So this idea of communion or co-union and learning, I think at a deep level, we're together. And it finally finished, for me, is I've learned more and more and more. The pull was towards a greater state of oneness, of our deep interconnection of God and connection. It's just like that's, I think, if you learn physics and the structure of the cosmos, the more you can feel it from the inside and out. The more you learn about your human body, the more intimately you are connected with it. And so I think these two pools, of knowledge, being integrated eventually turns towards wisdom by itself once it's integrated.
Yeah. And so this is not to say that knowledge is a bad thing, or we shouldn't strive for it. But I think, some people, I've noticed, I mean, it's been a long time since I've been doing this stuff with other people. But, if I remember back, I remember, noticing it in myself and also seeing in other people wanting to understand sort of, specific details about the structure of, they tend to come out with very, very baroque metaphysics, that really you can tell it's just a conceptual framework that they've come out with. And it's not, as you say, love is the sort of all-encompassing universal solvent for all of this stuff. But I think
so.
I would say if you feel yourself coming out with some very complicated metaphysical system, you've basically come out with a bunch of concepts which are not really worth. You've kind of traded the real gold for a false gold, in a way. And it's quite a big thing in the psychedelic scene. People start talking, and all this kind of complicated stuff comes out about different angels and levels of this and this this planet and that, and it's like, well, in a way, I mean, this might be my own bias, and I'm perfectly happy to own that, but I feel like it's kind of missing the point. But I know people would be listening to that and thinking, God, what a complete asshole. But never mind.
No, I'm with you. I think if they're coming out feeling more disconnected and separate from our world, yourself, other humans, you're missing the point. If you're coming some metaphysics and it's all abstract, and you're moving away from your body and immediate experience, and all of a sudden you feel alienated, or other people's are aliens from, because your worldview is so different and you're no longer having this felt heart connection, you are missing the point. So all these models and constructs, if they pull us away from what's real and deeper relationships, whether it's nature, ourselves, our family, whatever, I think it's taking a step backwards for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've made so many notes, but there's just a couple of points, given the time that you've got, I'd love to just touch into. So one is,
keep going.
The fact that psilocybin is very, very, very low level of toxicity. One of the things people kind of worry is like, oh, you're kind of destroying your body and that kind of thing. And, what is actually coming to light more and more as people study psilocybin as a substance more, is that it actually does good things for your body. And one of the things that you've touched on is neurogenesis. And could you just unpack that a little bit for people listening? First of all, what is neurogenesis, and how does it happen with psilocybin?
The neurobiology is just unbelievable. It's incredible. Scientists really didn't know neurogenesis, meaning that the brain can continue to grow by taking the substance until like the 1990s. So it's still not in the paradigm of most humans. That's something just so profound. It's really possible by something even especially so simple. And we have this, the stigma that drugs are bad and they corrupt, all these things, and they're placed within that. And so we definitely have to separate that there's so many different kinds of drugs and substances. And Specifically with this class, we'll look at the tryptamines that connect to the serotonin receptor sites, specifically here psilocybin. So what we found out was starting, within the last 10 years of MRI studies, it hyperconnects the brain. And it does this by quieting what's known as the default mode network in the brain. And the default mode network lights up when you think of yourself, like I, me, like I want ice cream, or I'm depressed, like self-absorbance or in fear. This network within your brain continues to light up and build. And it's overdeveloped in people with depression and anxiety. It makes sense, because if you're in pain, like depression, you can't help but keep thinking of yourself. You're self-absorbed. So this network gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And so it's correlated, they call it almost like it's the ego network. It's the me network. That part dissolves largely within psilocybin. And what they found is that this network acts as a repressive factor for the rest of the brain. Just like, you would say in different spiritual traditions that the ego acts almost as a repressor for the rest of your psyche or yourself. And so as the ego quiets down, you're flooded with all this more information and say even deeper wisdom or archetypal content, or, as Jung would probably even say, even the collective unconscious that we're all part of. And so as this quiets down, the brain hyperconnects, correlated with a lot more creativity. A lot of these neuronal connections begin to form and stabilize. So a lot of these structures not just connect in that moment, some of the structures begin to stay connected afterwards. And so it creates a new level of neuroplasticity. The brain gets to rearrange in a beautiful, and then the practical approach that happens in life with insights and so on in people's lives, and patterns change. But with the neurogenesis, the growth of the new neurons, it also stimulates what's known as spinal genesis, on the re-enlivening of dendrites. And so one way depression also looks like in the brain is parts of the brain are no longer connecting and talking to each other. I believe this correlates to, I think, a root part of the experience of depression, which is isolation. So for me, what I've seen with working with a lot of clients, depression is this feeling of I'm disconnected, I'm not enough, I don't like myself. And there's a disconnection between you and the rest of the living larger systems we're a part of. But the brain is also becoming disconnected with parts of itself. And a lot of the dendrites, the parts of the neuron that connect to others, have atrophy. Psilocybin re-enlivens those connections and they come back to life. Fundamentally healing a lot of the suppression, creating a more wholeness in our brain, in our psyche, and within our relationships. Just so it's absolutely phenomenal. Locks into the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, as I mentioned, with more affinity than serotonin itself. It's one of the safest compounds on the planet. Far more than any of the psychoactive substances, but far more than aspirin, for example. Theoretically, you could take, it's theoretical, 1,000 doses, right? I mean, you need a bag of mushrooms in your body, it's fine. The limits more common with, psychological and emotional limits, meaning how much can I tolerate? If you take too much, you probably just pass out because it's just so overwhelming. So even though you can take quite a lot, we play with a few grams. Terence McKenna is noted with calling just 5 grams, which is like a small handful of mushrooms is a heroic dose. So we're still playing on the lower level of these things. And most people, take half an eighth of a gram, which is very small, or an eighth. And so there's a lot of limits we could do. And so it's just one thing to really bring into our system that this is really safe. As Paul Stamets, a mycologist, notes with microdosing, even just taking a little bit every day can also still stimulate this growth, happening in their brain, and helps a lot of people get off of antidepressants, for example, and bring more joy into their lives.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And talking to Paul Stamets, I was listening to you talking in a podcast episode, and you mentioned this amazing film, Fantastic Fungi, on Netflix, and I would so recommend people watch that. Thank you for turning me on to that. It's a brilliant film. Paul Stamets, what a guy. I mean, the work he's done is absolutely incredible.
Totally.
So yeah, that's great. Growing your brain. I love it. It's so it's so the opposite of what the kind of old, more conservative people that have got no understanding of these substances. They think that one of the classic phrases is "you're rotting your brain," and that's the opposite is actually happening here. which
Totally.
so good to hear. And so the last thing I
Yeah.
wanted to touch on was that you talked about the stoned ape theory, and that it's something that Terence and Dennis McKenna started talking about a long time ago, and that the basic premise is that the encounter with psilocybin mushrooms is what turbo boosted the evolution of humans. And that's why when we look at ourselves, the things we are doing are so different to the other animals that live on this planet. And they're kind of, their answer, Dennis and Terence McKenna's, their answer was that difference is the result of the encounter with psilocybin mushrooms. I mean, you could probably broaden it out to psychedelics in general. I mean, I don't know particularly why they honed it down onto that one. But I think it was because it was coming, the apes were coming across it more likely because of the environment they lived in. You don't have ayahuasca growing in the savannah. But could you just sort of elaborate on the theory, because it is, it's a hypothesis, so we don't know this for sure, but it's a really interesting one. And I think when one's had experience with these substances, it makes sense, because you can feel how much it changes you as a person.
Absolutely. So the brothers Terence and McKenna were the first to propose this idea, and the logic being, Terence has said that, well, we know these substances expand consciousness, and consciousness expanded, in our evolutionary history. So was there something in the environment that created this expansion? Which for me is, using Occam's razor, is the most fundamental rational explanation for the expansion of our consciousness. There might have been something in the environment that did it. It's just looking towards our diet and science, and as you shared, we chose psilocybin mushrooms because, as Paul Stamets himself notes, it's the most common mushroom in the African savannas where it evolved. Psilocybin mushrooms grow on every continent but Antarctica, so they're plentiful, and easily available in so many places. So they would have been there where we evolved in Africa, and then continue to migrate. The idea being that our primate ancestors, we lived and evolved at the canopies and trees for about 50 million years. Weather patterns began to change, forcing our ancestors down to the ground. And as Paul Stamets himself knows, there's at least 19 different primates that are known to eat mushrooms. Some of them come down from the canopies of trees to eat mushrooms. So if we didn't already eat mushrooms by the time we came down the ground, we eventually would have ate them as we began to follow herds of cattle. Mushrooms are coprophilic, dung loving. So as we're following cattle all the time and eventually herding and living with them, the mushrooms would have been constantly, in the cattle's footsteps. The oldest archaeological evidence we have of mushroom use is going back in 9,000 BCE, of cave paintings of mushrooms in Africa, I believe in Algeria, right? So there's a lot of things that kind of point to this. The idea being that at first we took small amounts, then larger, and eventually developed rituals. The idea that this happened, as Paul Stamets himself says, millions of times over millions of years. And we can look at scientific studies now of how profound these experiences are in one person's life. 67% of the time have a mystical experience. Lives change radically. There's more creativity, empathy, and so on. The same was probably true for our ancestors. And the idea of, if this happened for generations and generations and generations, it would have had a huge impact in culture. As McKenna notes, likely itself, it was a catalyst for language. Mushrooms and psychedelics have this experience of synesthesia, where the senses are conflated. So all of a sudden smells become colors, or ideas become feelings. And so the idea that within our consciousness, because we're this unity, there was this meshing where symbols and thoughts emerged with sound, and we created language, which radically developed and changed our culture. And so it would have created a more cohesive, also tribal system, a greater sense of empathy and oneness. So the species that we came from, if they used the mushrooms, would have had greater survival advantages. I'm forgetting this. I think it's wrong something. It was a psychologist in the 70s gave small amounts of psilocybin to different test subjects and found what was increased was visual acuity, greater edge detection. Objects appear more 3D and more well-defined. So it would have given our ancestors greater survival tactics of noticing, say, snakes in the ground or noticing different kinds of fruits and leaves, right? So it would have enhanced our senses with likely smaller, higher doses, their sexual arousal, increasing our desire for copulation. So we've been breeding more, and a little bit more doses, more creativity, and eventually spiritual experiences. So it would have had a profound impact on our culture. And then looking all the way back to the oldest religious scripture, the Rig Vedas, the beginning of Hinduism, I think they have like 200 lines talking about soma, which is a plant or fungus that allows them to connect to the gods. And so this went on for a very long time and largely fell away at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, where we figured out that seeds turn into plants and trees. Mushrooms grow from spores, so they're very elusive. And we didn't know until the 1970s and then the 80s, because of Terrence Dennis McKenna, How to Grow Psilocybin Mushrooms. They published the first psilocybin mushroom growers guide. So, as I spent in the book, just really breaking down the logic of how and why. I think it's our greatest framework. And so it's proposed as a hypothesis. And I talked to, going up and asked Paul Stamets, at a festival a few years ago, what does it need to be a theory? And he's like, well, we need some more correlation. This correlates with creativity. And those tests have been done, especially with LSD and now with psilocybin. And so he shared at Burning Man at the MAPS talks in 2019. He says, I think we have now enough evidence put together that this can be a full-fledged theory. So I think the framework is there to really begin to take this very seriously.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I think, like you say, that it's creativity is the heart of the experience, and creativity is the heart of cultural evolution. And it's, it's the engine of it all. And it's that kind of creativity going into hyperdrive that happened, and it just exploded at a certain point. But I mean, one thing that did come to mind for me was that there are other animals that eat psychedelic plants and fungi, and they have the experiences. But has that been addressed? Why? So let's say reindeer eat fly agaric mushrooms, and I know fly agaric mushrooms are very different experience to the psilocybin ones, but just as an example, why aren't reindeer driving around in cars and singing opera?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So just to elaborate on the relationship between psychoactives and animals, Giorgio Saramani, and he's an Italian ethnobotanist, wrote this book called Animals and Psychedelics, definitely looking at all the ways animals interact with psychedelics. And there's even a larger book, is Ronald K. Seal, who's a UCLA psychopharmacologist and professor there, and I think died a couple of years ago, but he wrote this book, Intoxication, based on 20 years of work there. And he saw that about 92% of the animal kingdom uses psychoactive substances. It's so widespread in nature that he calls it the fourth drive of evolution. So after, like, say, sleep and sex and water and food, given the opportunity, an animal will change its consciousness chemically. And we've been missing this point because we're normally around domesticated animals. But a lot of them, say cat with catnips, and dogs are known to go eat mushrooms if it's available. There's a drive within us. I think it's a transcendental drive to shift our consciousness. Giorgio Saramani says, for one reason, perhaps it's deconditioning agents. It enables new patterns of behavior. Like you're saying, something creative that you can arrange. And so it has quite evolutionary advantages. So we've missed the point that this is a big part of our nature to change our consciousness. And it's a part of the larger embedded evolutionary system we're part of. And to the question of why have other animals not evolved to the same with us? One answer is they have a very different evolutionary trajectory. So a reindeer, as much mushroom as it eats, it's not going to turn into a human. I think the physiology of the animal has quite an impact, right? So it can eat all the mushrooms it wants, but it's not going to be a tool building animal. It has hooves, right? Yeah. So there's just fundamental structures where we're like, we have these opposable thumbs that like evolved because we're swinging on branches, right? So now I can move and pick up things with my hands and make things. The ranger might give them, and I saw this once in a dream myself, that it's the mushroom says, I've been helping animals for a very long time, helping them make decisions, giving them courage and how to migrate, how to move, and so on. So it probably has given and helped a lot of animals do different things. But we've been able to really shape our environment because of these hands, you know, whether creating structures, houses, or blueprints. You know, we've really redefined the terra, you know, of our planet. And another thing is our brains changed a lot while we were primates, you know, whether because of taking psychedelics smallly or just we're mammals, you know, that's a big part of the evolutionary process. So we empathically connect with others of like us very deeply. And so hence the evolutionary language. So we had a certain kind of hardware that was predisposed to make more out of these psychedelic experiences, you know. So most other animals didn't have their own physiology, but also this biological system that can make the most out of the psilocybin.
Those are pretty good points, actually. Yeah, it's such an enormous topic because it's been something I've been interested in for so long. Maybe we'll do a part 2 one day. But
I love that.
You've been very generous with your time, and it's fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. So just for people listening, could you just say again, well, I mean, do you have a website that people can?
Yes, do. Yeah. It's psychedelicevolution.org. So psychedelic evolution, all the same.org. Yeah. And the book's name is The Psilocybin Connection. It's all available for pre-order right now, and it's complete. It's my dissertation. You know, it just took a long process to work with the publishers to get it out, but it'll be shipped to you in about a little less than 4 months.
Great. Well, that's you know, what a wonderful service to humanity to kind of, you know, put that treatise out into all the research you've done.
I'm so honored. It felt like the best thing I could do. The way like my being was moved to show up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jahan. So it's been an absolute pleasure. I made all the music that I use in my podcasts. If you'd like to hear more of my music, please visit SoundCloud and check out my profile, Ralph Cree.